G'day, welcome to Walking Through the Word. My name's James Hornby. I'm the lead minister of the All Saints Anglican Network. So join me as we walk through the Word, each week unpacking a portion of the Bible, and feel free to comment, to ask questions, to get involved, and we'll work through this together. I'm so glad you can join us. Duck inside as we get on to the next episode. Well, welcome to week 2 at Looking Through Luke. We're picking it up in chapter 1, verse 5. Last week we saw that Luke is writing this account of the ministry and life of Jesus in order that we might be certain of the things that we believe. And it's so good whether you're trying to work out what you think about Jesus or whether you believe in Jesus and follow Jesus. It's always good to revisit and examine and think and know not just what you believe, but why you believe it. And so we're picking up today in our section a part of the story where Luke tells us of the announcement of the birth of a man who'll be named John. About 11 years ago, I was sitting down at our dinner table one night, and my wife, Karen, she'd come and she'd serve dinner, and I was eating, and she went off to do something. And when she came back to the table, she said, "Guess what?" And I turned around and said, "What?" And she said, "Surprise." And she pulled out a pregnancy test. And friends, you know what? I was surprised. Now, you'd expect the average reaction to the news that you're about to have a baby to be in the general vicinity of joy and excitement. Sadly, I hadn't learnt that lesson, and what came out was real, but it wasn't joyous and it wasn't excitement. It was shock and fear. Oh no, we're going to have a baby. I'm not ready for this. I don't know if I can be a dad. I don't know if we can be parents. I don't know if I'm ready to have my life turned upside down. I wish I could go back and tweak my reaction. Karen didn't respond so wonderfully to it, and it's a little embarrassing now as I think back on it. In this story from verse 5, we hear, and we'll read in a second, Zechariah being told that he's about to have a boy. And Zechariah's reaction gives me some comfort. I'm probably not the only person in the world that's ever reacted with surprise or shock or even fear to the news of having a baby. Let me read from verse 5. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all of the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because they were not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time came for the burning of incense, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. And then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was startled and gripped with great fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth." Well, the story goes on, and we'll pick that up next week. But what we have here is actually a story about a couple who have a tragic situation. They are childless. Now, there may be even people watching this who have experienced the pain of childlessness, of being barren, of not being able to have children and have a family together. And if you know that pain, my heart goes out to you. But Zechariah and Elizabeth know what it's like. And they live in a cultural context where having children was everything. As strange as it might sound to our ears, for many people today, having children almost comes across as if it's a lifestyle choice. Will we have children this week or next year or the year after? Does it fit into our lifestyle? Have we done enough travelling? Are we at the point in our lives where we need to focus on our career? Do we have room for children? Zechariah and Elizabeth don't have the benefit either of the miracle of modern medicine. These days with IVF and with everything that's available, people who once upon a time could never have had children now still have a chance and hope, and for many still experience the joy and wonder of having kids. In fact, some friends of mine experienced miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage until finally doctors, through tests and exams and breaking down chemical compositions of things going on, were able to identify at what part in the process this miscarriage was occurring. And with the right chemicals, were able to fix that, and sure enough, they fell pregnant and gave birth to a son. Well, for Zechariah and Elizabeth, there's no luxury, and for those around them, if you couldn't have children, you could never have children. And they lived at a time where having children was everything. Children were everything. They were a sign that God was pleased with you, that you were blessed. They were your insurance policy. There was no life insurance. There was no work cover. If you got sick or injured, if your husband died, your children were the ones that would care for you. Your children would inherit your wealth and the responsibility and the status that went along with it. And so having children was so important. If you didn't have children, you didn't have a future. Well, Zechariah and Elizabeth, tragically, aren't able to have children. And we know that they desperately wanted kids. We know that it was a desire and longing of their heart, because later on we hear the angel say to Zechariah that God has heard their prayer, heard the cry of their heart. Well, what's unusual about this is that Luke goes to great lengths to show us that Zechariah and Elizabeth have the right pedigree. They are the kind of people you'd expect God to show his favour on. We read that Zechariah is a priest. He's a servant of God. He administers worship in the temple and in the sanctuary. He's one of those that represents God to the people. And he's married to a woman who is a descendant of Aaron, the first high priest of Israel. So they have the right pedigree spiritually. They come from the right stock. We also know they live exemplary lives. We read, both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Firstly, they live really good lives. They're the kind of people you want as neighbours or friends, the kind of people you'd look up to, the kind of people you'd want mentoring your kids and pouring themselves into your family. They were really good people, people of exemplary character, exemplary conduct. But they are also righteous in the sight of God. What does that mean? Well, it means that they follow the law that God had given Moses and that Israel were following of what it looked like to live in a way that pleased God, what it looked like to live as if you belonged to God. There were a lot of rules and stipulations, and by Zechariah's day, a lot of them had been twisted by religious leaders and misused, but at the heart, the law was about living rightly before God. And we're told, Luke tells us that that's exactly what Zechariah and Elizabeth do. They are blameless. They love God and they live in a way that demonstrates that. In other words, as they observe all the commands blamelessly, they are the kind of people you'd expect God to favour. And yet there's this one great disappointment in their lives. They're childless. And being childless was often seen as a judgment of God or a punishment, the result of having done something that displeased God. And so Luke wants us to see, actually, they're not being punished, they're not being judged, They're good people. They're righteous people. They have God's favour. But sometimes in life, things don't work out the way that we hope. Sometimes the yearnings of our hearts are left unmet for a season, for many years, sometimes for our entire lives. And I wonder if you've ever experienced that longing for something, or the pain of not having something, and suspecting or blaming or accusing God that it's His doing, it's His fault. That God's somehow out to get you because you didn't make the grade. You didn't live up to what He wanted. Well, Zechariah and Elizabeth have made the grade. They have lived righteously and blamelessly. God is delighted with them, and yet they experience this great pain and disappointment. Well, the day comes where Zechariah is serving in the temple. And not just any temple, the temple of Jerusalem. He's one of about 18,000 priests. And morning and night, incense was offered in the temple. And so lots were taken to see who would carry out that great privilege, that great honour. It may not seem like much to you and I, but to people who were devoted to serving God and worshipping God, the opportunity to lead worship and to go into the holy place in the temple and offer up incense on behalf of the people as worship was the highest honour. It was the pinnacle of your ministry career. If you were fortunate, you might get to do that 2 or 3 times in your lifetime. And so the day comes and it's Zechariah's turn. And he goes into the temple and he's offering up incense, and suddenly an angel appears. Well, we read that Zechariah was terrified. I don't know about you. I don't know if you've ever had an angel just appear to you. But I think being terrified is a pretty reasonable response. Sometimes I'm terrified just simply when I get up in the morning and look in the mirror. So you can imagine what it'd be like to have a celestial being suddenly standing alongside you. He's terrified. And so what does the angel say? Well, the angel says, do not be afraid, Zechariah. I'm sure that helped, but we still get the sense that he's gripped with fear. What's important, though, is the message. What does the angel say? He says, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. It's interesting, isn't it? Your prayer has been heard. Does that mean that all this time God hadn't been listening? He'd been busy off doing other things, and Zechariah had been lifting up and praying, oh God, I've got this ache, I've got this pain, I've got this disappointment, I've got this longing. But God was too busy doing the dishes and making his bed and sorting out the angels and to hear. No, it doesn't mean that, does it? That doesn't mean that God heard and forgot, meant to make a mental checklist and write it down but missed it. Does it mean that when it says that God heard, that in that moment, finally, God was like, I think Zechariah's done enough to get my attention? Well, no, it doesn't mean any of those things. See, God always hears. And God heard the very first time that Zechariah ever brought that longing to God in his heart. But what we see is when God hears, he also acts. And sometimes that acting of God is invisible. Sometimes it's in ways that we don't conceive because we're looking for a particular action. The angel says to Zechariah, God has heard. He's always been hearing. And now the time has come for him to act. Your wife Elizabeth's going to bear you a son, and you're to call him John. Does that mean that if we never get the things that we ask for, that God has never heard? No, of course it doesn't mean that either. But God's doing something new here in the lives of people, and he's working through this particular situation. Zechariah, his name actually means Yahweh or God has remembered again. And you can imagine after praying for something and asking God for something over and over again, you might begin to wonder if God has forgotten, if God hasn't heard, if God will never hear. But in this moment, the angel appears and says, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Zechariah, God has remembered again. Now, he hasn't just remembered, as we'll see, for Zechariah's benefit. We're going to see that actually he's remembered not just Zechariah, but his people, the Israelites, and ultimately all people. He says, you're going to name your son John. Well, that's a bit strange. It may not be for us. John's a good name, maybe not as good as James, but it's still a good name. But in Zechariah's day, you would name your son after yourself, just as you'd been named after your father. So if you were to have a son, especially after all these years, you would name your son Zechariah. That would be his name. But no, the angel says his name is to be John. Well, what does John mean? Well, John means Yahweh, or God, has been gracious. He's been gracious to Zechariah and Elizabeth. He's given them the very thing they've longed for at a time when conceivably it's impossible. There's no way that they could ever have a child. They're too old. But God has been gracious and He's given them the very thing that their hearts have longed for. But He hasn't just been gracious to Zechariah and Elizabeth, He's been gracious to the world. And we're going to unpack next week why that's the case. But it's all about John's message and what John will do, and ultimately who he points to, that enables the angel to truthfully say, God has been gracious. In giving John, he's giving to the people ultimately something that they do not deserve. Well, we see that in the way that he finishes off. The angel says he will be a joy, that's John, will be a joy and delight to you, to Zechariah and Elizabeth. We'd hope that the birth of a child will bring great joy to their parents. And despite the fact that I was shocked and terrified at the news that I was going to be a dad, when my daughter was born 9 months later, it was one of the most incredible joys I've ever experienced. But more than that, says the angel, he's not just going to be a joy to his parents, he's going to be a joy to many. Many will rejoice at his birth. To find out why, we're going to have to come back next week and revisit it. But as we go, I want to encourage you. Firstly, if you're praying for something and you're longing for something and you're calling out to God for something, and maybe it hasn't materialized, maybe it hasn't worked out, maybe it seems like there's radio silence, God hears. He's heard. And you and I need to trust that God will continue to act in ways that are good and right and holy and ultimately fit in with his plans and purposes, despite what we can see. Secondly, God cares. He hasn't just heard, he cares. He cares for you in your grieving. He cares for you and I in our longings and in our disappointments and in the things that we hope for. But ultimately, the answer to those longings is found in God himself. Thirdly, there is still great joy to be had, even more than the joy of becoming parents. We spend so much of our time and energy and resources into trying to attain happiness in our lives, and yet so often that happiness is fleeting. It's here 1 minute and it's gone the next. And in this announcement, as we'll see, Luke is telling us through the angel to Zechariah that there is a source of joy that's available for many people, that many will rejoice. And that joy, I'm going to suggest as we look at it, is actually available to you and I, and is the deepest source of joy and the one thing we truly need to make sense of the world. We're going to need to do more work, so come back next time as we continue to look through Luke, and we're going to pick up this announcement of John's birth, and we're going to look at the rest of what the angel has to say and what happens to Zechariah. Thanks for sticking with me. Can't wait to get into it next time. See ya. Thanks so much for watching, and if you made a comment, thanks for participating. Open to suggestions too, so let us know what would be helpful. If you did get something out of it, I'd love it if you just like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the like bell notification, hit the like. What it does, it really helps the YouTube algorithm and gets these out to more and more people. So we're not trying to build a massive following or a massive channel. We're actually just trying to communicate the truth of who Jesus is. And if that's something that resonates with you, we'd love your support by doing those two simple things. Thank you. See ya.